I'll just put it this way. I'm very hopeful for rapamycin. I think if it's used correctly, it will end up showing that it has some pretty profound effects on longevity and potentially on health span. What do you want out of your life? You can't win it 100% everything. You kind of have to play this balancing act. You can't go extreme one way and still get the extreme of the other as well. This is tough. This is one of those questions where it's like make or break if a person's going to continue listening to you or
Yeah.
not.
Nicholas, welcome to the show.
Hey, welcome. I'm really happy to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited to also have you on the show. You have a great YouTube channel, and yeah, you have like a lot of very interesting videos about different new studies and new supplements and just longevity and science in general. So yeah, like I find it very useful myself to kind of browse a lot of the videos that you have.
Well, I can say likewise. I mean, I know you've got a ton of content out there dissecting the science on, especially longevity in the longevity space. I've watched several of your videos. I really like them.
Yeah, like likewise. But your speciality in a lot of ways is autophagy, which is something that was very popular, something like 5 or 4 years ago. It still is, but that was like when I made a lot of my own videos back then about that topic, and it got like a lot of views, and it was like this massive kind of buzzword almost back then. But you're an actual like researcher of autophagy, so yeah, how did you like get into researching that specifically?
So I got into researching autophagy in the lab throughout my PhD. So I did undergrad work in mitochondria, specifically in like bioenergetics and metabolism, and then I got into a master's program, and I was still doing mitochondria and bioenergetics. And then when I went for my PhD, the lab that I joined, I brought my bioenergetics experience and brought that to this lab, and this lab was very focused on mitochondria and autophagy. And it's especially a particular type of autophagy called mitophagy, which I'm sure you've discussed before, where, with the, which is just autophagy of mitochondria. It's just a fancy word for that.
Mm, right. And I guess we can start with what is autophagy. Like there's a lot of different definitions of it out there. And of course there's like, dozens of different types of autophagy out there. But as like, yeah, like the umbrella term, what does it like actually describe?
Yeah, autophagy is just so the word itself indicates what it is, right? It's auto, so you're basically consuming self, and that's essentially what it is. It's just this mechanism that we can obviously get into more details on it, but this mechanism by which your cells are able to take up different proteins and lipids and organelles and just destroy them and just eliminate them for a number of different reasons. But that's the simplest explanation. Although, like you said, there are many different types of phages, like xenophagy or autophagy or mitophagy, and there's different versions that ultimately fulfill different functions, but they all kind of operate very similarly.
Yeah. Yeah, I was like reading about that. Then yeah, you have like virophagy and bacteriophagy and like you said, xenophagy and agrophagy and yeah, almost like a phagy for every kind of organ in the body.
Yeah, yeah, definitely, exactly.
But how does it like relate to longevity? I know like one of the main, let's say, selling points or like the ideas behind autophagy was that it's important for longevity to remove these dead cell parts that accumulate during aging.
Yeah, so you could just that one question, which is a really good question. That one question could probably be filled up with like an hour's worth of content just because the sheer complexity of what happens. So, but I'll give you just like one brief way that autophagy strongly contributes to not just lifespan, but health span as well. So one thing that happens with aging, especially let's say around mitochondria, is that you can experience what's known as proteotoxicity, where you get this accumulation of dysfunctional proteins or mistargeted proteins. What do I mean by mistargeted proteins? Is your cell will produce proteins and they actually have tags on them that tell or kind of biochemically tell the cell where to place them. So they should be in different compartments of the cell so that they can fulfill their particular function. So think of like you wouldn't want a lifeguard at I don't know, in a sauna, or you wouldn't want a lifeguard as a police officer. You need to put these different functional proteins, these different roles in their specific area. So there can be mistargeting of proteins, which happens with aging as our DNA structure gets damaged and whatnot. That ultimately leads to these proteins that may be functional, but their targeting is mislabeled to the point where they end up going to the wrong areas within the cell. So they can accumulate, which is called proteotoxicity, around these organelles like mitochondria, which ultimately then leads to autophagy to come in and eliminate either the mitochondrion or eliminate these aggregates of proteins that are just kind of stuck within the cell. And once you've eliminated those, then you've cleared up space and allowed the cell to potentially produce the correct protein and target it to the correct spot. And that's just one example. I mean, there are many, many others.
Mm, yeah. Yeah, like with age, like, there's things go wrong in a lot of ways with aging. And, you're even like when you're not like particularly old, if you're like in a disease state or some inflammatory condition, you're gonna have more, dysfunctional cell parts and kind of junk material around that just can accumulate.
Yeah.
I think it was in like 2021 when they actually recognized this disabled autophagy as one of the new hallmarks of aging, like some year around there.
Yeah, you're exactly right. So, and there's so much complexity that comes around autophagy, but the disabling of autophagy can happen through a number of different ways. One of the more common ones, and that actually happens in Alzheimer's as well, or some of the models of Alzheimer's, is that in the terminal stages, so the late stages of autophagy, you have this phagosome, this vesicle that's formed that is very capable of, you know, encapsulating and capturing different components of the cell and degrading them and destroying them. But the way that it degrades it and destroys these proteins is by fusing with another vesicle called the lysosome. And that lysosome contains enzymes within it that destroy anything that's found inside this other vesicle once they've merged. And the pH is also extremely acidic, so it essentially destroys, again, another mechanism by which it gets destroyed. And when you have dysfunctional autophagy, or one example of dysfunctional autophagy is the lysosomes can have an increase in pH, which ultimately leads them not to be acidic anymore. So even if they were to fuse with this phagosome, this autophagosome, then you don't get the destruction of the protein. So it's kind of like gets stuck in this mechanism where you have the fusion, everything should be working normally, but it just simply doesn't destroy those proteins. And like I said, that's just one example of dysfunction that can occur.
This episode is brought to you by Bond Charge, my favorite company for blue blocking glasses, red light therapy devices, and red light bulbs. These items are essential for keeping your sleep-wakefulness cycles aligned in a world that tries to mess them up. Instead of looking at your phone before bed and letting the blue light disrupt your melatonin production, why not wear blue blockers instead that prevent that from happening? Instead of having your bedroom lit up with bright lights, use the more sleep-friendly alternative by opting for flicker-free red light bulbs that don't disrupt your sleep. Bond Charge also has amazing infrared sauna blankets that can give you the same health benefits as the traditional sauna. You also get the unique benefits of infrared light that improves joint and skin health. Head over to bondcharge.com/SiimLund and use the code SIIM, SIIM, for a 15% discount. I remember reading about it as well several years ago that I guess the origin of autophagy, or where does it come from, itself is also kind of a mystery, that we don't know where it kind of forms, or like where does it come from. It just kind of appears and then dissolves those cell parts. Like there's no, like, I guess, there's always the depiction that it's like Pac-Man inside your cells, but there's no like Pac-Man inside your cells that is actually doing it. So like the autophagy is just a process. It's not like an actual entity, or it's not a cell inside, or it's not like a cell particle itself. You can't like pinpoint this is autophagy. It's like it forms and then it does its work, and it's kind of I don't know, like some collective consciousness of the cell.
Yeah, yeah, but I think that's probably true for almost anything inside the cell. It's not like cells sit there and think about like, oh, now we need to deal with
Mm.
certain components within ourselves. Autophagy is triggered by a number of different molecules, that ultimately lead to an organelle called the endoplasmic reticulum to start pinching off these sections, these blobs that come off of it, these big sacs, which are
Mm,
called phagosomes. And then those mature into what I was describing earlier with the eventual forming with the lysosome to create the autolysosome, which is the ultimate form of autophagy, which ultimately then destroys all these different components like we've been describing.
mm. And what does it, what's the outcome of that? So like it dissolves those things. Uh, does it use that for energy, or does it use it to do some other processes, or what does it like the happens to the actual trash?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, uh, a number of different mechanisms that can come from autophagy. So autophagy will come in. You have all these functional proteins or an organelle, which is made up of lipids and carbohydrates and proteins, and will destroy it into its component parts. So that can be like single amino acids, which then can be recycled, and they often are, but not completely. Not everything is perfect in a biological process. So then you can get some loss of those amino acids. Or you can get the destruction of different lipids to make them into smaller lipids, like fat molecules. The carbohydrates can be broken down and potentially be recycled for, let's say, glycogen synthesis, or there's any number of different mechanisms by which all these different components. So some of them can be rebuilt, and some of them just get excreted or released or oxidized in some way.
Mm, gotcha. You mentioned like there's different molecules that trigger autophagy, and this is also like very contentious topic or very conflicting opinions about it online. There's this saying that okay, you need to fast 7 days or something to even activate autophagy, and you can't even have coffee in your fasted state, and yeah, like just anything that has calories is immediately gonna break autophagy. And yeah, what do you think about that?
Yeah, so that's definitely. I'm sure you've seen this all the time on social media with the big headlines of activate autophagy, or you're like you said, perfectly stated. Like if you don't fast for exactly this amount of time, autophagy is not happening whatsoever, and that's not at all what happens within the cells. The way I explain it is really simply just think of autophagy like a dimmer switch, just like a lot of processes that are happening within your cells. So you can either dim autophagy where autophagy is not as active and you've got kind of the opposite happening, let's say building and growth and whatnot, or you can increase autophagy, so you're increasing the light of autophagy, and then the other systems are probably not going to be as active. So it's really just this ebb and flow. But there are things that you can do, like you mentioned, fasting, for example, is definitely one of the ways that you can severely increase autophagy. One question I get asked is like, how long should a person fast to see these increases in autophagy? And the answer is we don't actually know. There's no research other than animal research, which is just it's really difficult to translate that because a mouse's lifespan, especially in within the what's the word I'm looking containing within like a day is not reproducible for humans. Like we can't say, oh, well, a mouse fasted for 18 hours, so therefore we should look at intermittent fasting and say, oh, that should apply to humans as well. There was one study looking at intermittent fasting recently, and they looked at some markers, I say quote unquote markers of autophagy, and really they did not look at markers of autophagy. It was reported as if it was markers of autophagy, but the actual molecules, the genes that they looked at were kind of upstream of autophagy. So they could have actually acted on any number of other mechanisms. It's just people were attributing it to autophagy. So up to this point, from a fasting perspective, we just don't have good human evidence yet.
Hmm. Right. Yeah, so like fasting does increase autophagy, yeah, but how long is what is the optimal fasting window is obviously depends a lot on other things as well then.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. What about like, exercise and certain like the dietary components?
Yeah, so exercise is one we do have better evidence for. We actually do have several human studies that have looked at exercise and autophagy. And while, some researchers might debate on the quality of some of that evidence, the overall trend of the evidence in human trials is that exercise does potently increase autophagy. So it has probably the greatest. Again, we don't know the fasting data, so we can't really, do a side-by-side comparison, but you can definitely say exercise is definitely in the top three of massive ways to dramatically improve autophagy. And I would say also that that probably applies more than just to like skeletal muscle. It probably applies across the entire physiology. So in that way, exercise is just this really potent trigger.
Mm.
Um, the the types of exercise that they've looked at, that they've focused on, is more endurance style as well as high intensity interval training. So they haven't focused nearly as much on like resistance training. And I think there's a lot of research that needs to be done to really tease out those details. But as it stands, the current evidence indicates that exercise is definitely a great way to go.
Mm. Yeah, if I recall correctly, then there was in one of those studies that something like 30 minutes of high intensity aerobic exercise was able to like activate autophagy quite a lot. So yeah, like you don't need to yeah like necessarily fast for so several days, whereas if you just you can exercise.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm. Um, but I've also seen that these dietary polyphenols and coffee and teas they also at least in like cell studies increase autophagy.
Yeah, that's true. So polyphenols. I know coffee has been shown to increase autophagy. I know there have been animal studies on it. Maybe in humans, you're kind of stretching my memory there because I did briefly look at that literature, but I don't remember exactly. Um, the other thing that I will say is that anything, I'm sure you've discussed this protein before, because of the style of content that you produce, but like the protein AMPK,
Mm.
which is this, sensor of the metabolic state of the cell. And anytime you have AMPK that's activated, and the way that it's activated is by increases in ADP levels. So our cells, for anybody listening, our cells are primarily function on ATP. So ATP then gets turned into ADP, and then ADP gets converted into AMP. And this AMPK is highly sensitive, is a little bit sensitive to ADP, but highly, highly sensitive to AMP. So if AMP levels rise and bind to AMPK, you get this mass activation of AMPK, which is probably the greatest trigger of autophagy. It does many, many other things, as I'm sure you've discussed before as well. It does many things, but one of the chief things that it does is activate autophagy. So the reason why I'm mentioning that is because a lot of these different compounds like polyphenols or caloric restriction have huge effects on AMPK activation through either the increase in AMP or some of the other ways that AMPK can be activated.
Mm. So yeah, like these physiological stressors like exercise and even like caffeine and green tea and those things, they can activate AMPK, which then also increases autophagy.
Yep, exactly.
Mm. You mentioned AMPK, so the counterpart of that is mTOR, so this growth switch in the body, and that's all almost yeah like depicted as the kind of boogeyman in in longevity as well, and it directly suppresses autophagy, which is one of the reasons why they might think that it's linked to or it's associated with accelerated aging or reduced lifespan in animal studies. So yeah, and this ties into also like protein. That if you eat protein, you increase mTOR, you suppress autophagy, and you're accelerated aging. What do you think about that?
I think it makes a lot of sense. I sometimes hesitate because mTOR is another one of those proteins that's so powerful. It has tremendous effects on all kinds of different processes within the cells. Not to mention we have different isoforms, mTOR1, mTOR2, or at least the complexes. And so for me, when I think about mTOR, I do think that that is one of the major pathways, that it inhibits this autophagy pathway. That makes complete sense to me. However, I wouldn't be surprised if there were other ways that mTOR, like for example, mTOR activates some inflammatory pathways. It increases the amount of protein that's produced. And if we go back to this proteotoxicity example, then it's possible that mTOR may exacerbate the issue. There have been situations where, with certain chronic diseases, you see this upregulation of mTOR that's just chronically elevated. And I think that's one of the ideas behind rapamycin, if I remember correctly, that it at least brings that back down to closer to a healthy baseline. You don't want to absolutely eliminate mTOR because then, well, you die. But
Mhm.
um, just bringing that down a little bit. So there's a lot of different ways that we can think about mTOR and its effects on longevity. But I do think autophagy is definitely one of the major ones.
Mm. Yeah. Do you think like people should follow like a lower protein diet, or what do you think about that?
Well, that's tricky because for me, so one thing that I've been trying to define, and actually be really interested in your perspective on this, because one thing that I try to define is the difference between longevity and health span.
Mm.
So they're closely related, but they're not exactly the same. As in, there's certain things, and I haven't fully cleared up my thoughts on this, but there's certain things that I think increase longevity that help health span up to a point, and then they start becoming detrimental. And one of those is protein consumption. So, protein consumption, if you drop protein consumption down to like a minimum viable amount, you can potentially increase lifespan, but you may be dramatically affecting your health span in a negative way, in that you may not be able to maintain musculature, your bone mass, all these different aspects of health. So it's kind of a trade-off between the two.
Mm.
So I don't know. I mean, have you thought about this kind of that kind
Mm.
of interplay between the two before?
Yeah, like there is, yeah, definitely like some tension between, having big muscles and having very good health span and maximum lifespan. So yeah, like muscle mass is associated with reduced mortality, especially in elderly people. But it doesn't mean that having like, bodybuilder size muscles would make you live longer. That's probably not going to happen. Like most bodybuilders don't live like very long, um, besides, the steroids. But
Yeah.
I think there is some like overlap between health span and lifespan. So if you have like very low health span, then you're limiting your maximum lifespan. But in order to reach like maximum lifespan, then you probably won't be able to like, or like you probably need to like maybe something like 80-90% of your health span kind of optimize. So there's probably some balance between those things. But with regards to protein, then yeah, like there's the risk that if you are on a very low protein diet, you probably have like less muscle mass, and you increase your risk of hip fractures and frailty when you're older, especially. But if you're eating like super amounts of protein like a bodybuilder, then that probably will shorten your lifespan as well, in different mechanisms. I think something like a more moderate amount of protein is more appropriate. And if you look at the research, then something like 1.6 grams per kilogram or 0.8 grams per pound is kind of the sweet spot for maximum muscle growth, at least based on the studies, that you won't be even seeing more muscle growth even if you eat more protein than that either. So I like to kind of stick somewhere between, around there, the 0.7, 0.8 grams per pound of body weight.
Yeah, and there's even some debate on like the optimal amount of protein for muscle growth, which I don't know if you've ever had Menno Henselman on
I have,
the
yeah.
podcast before. Yeah, I'm sure
Yeah.
I mean he's more well versed than I am on the topic, but then you have people like Greg Nuckols and Eric Helms and whatnot. So you have these like different debates, but the
Mm.
idea is like within this general range, it's not like anybody is going to be like,
Yeah.
fivefold one way or fivefold another way. So yeah, I completely agree with you. I think that I think one thing that people need to consider is like, what do you want out of your life? You can't win at 100% everything. You kind of have to play this balancing act. You can kind of tilt one way or you can kind of tilt another way without impeding the other one too much. But you can't go extreme one way and still get the extreme of the other as well. So
Yeah.
it's just something to keep in mind.
Yeah. Yeah. Like being a pro athlete, generally athletes do live a little bit longer than the general population. But if you're
Yep.
like a pro athlete and, especially like ultra endurance athlete or something, then you're probably not going to live the most maximum lifespan for your genetic potential. So you're kind of losing a few years because of the excessive amounts of exercise that you might do. But yeah, so like obviously moderate amounts and slightly more than moderate, I think is generally healthy for your lifespan and health span.
Yeah, completely agree. That's well stated.
Yeah, and I think one problem with these more vague concepts is that you can't measure, or like we don't have a good way to measure autophagy and good measure way to measure mTOR either. So if we could measure and we know what is the optimal amount of this expression of these pathways, then we would actually maybe have some answers. But we don't even know exactly how much is too much or how much is too little. We only have certain like biomarkers, muscle mass, bone density, and certain blood markers. IGF-1 is kind of useful for assessing protein synthesis and frailty risk and cancer risk that you might experience if you have like very high mTOR expression. So there are a few handset of like markers that you can look at, and they have like a lot more like studies to kind of back up as well. Like we know that if you're below this threshold for muscle mass and muscle strength, then your risk of frailty and dying is much higher, and vice versa. If you're very high IGF-1 levels, then that's generally associated with higher risk of cancer and heart disease and other problems.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm. Are there any like supplements that can potentially also like help with autophagy?
Supplements is always a tricky one for me. I'm like looking specifically at supplements to induce autophagy. I think of like kind of calorie restrictive mimetic supplements, but none of them really jump off the board for me. Again, mainly because there just haven't been that many studies that have looked at autophagy markers. I mean, you stated it really well that looking at these autophagy markers, it's not an easy thing to do, especially when you're trying to say that, okay, let's say you were to measure like skeletal muscle mass. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to see increases in autophagy in like the liver or the brain or whatnot. So when we do look at these autophagy studies, and there are a lot of them, and some of them have looked at different supplements and whatnot. You, I don't actually know about glycine, but glycine just kind of fits within this kind of general idea of autophagy because of the mechanism of action that it works through. But you have these studies that are in animal studies typically because you need to do a lot of these invasive surgeries and whatnot. So you need to take like brain tissue, you may need to take liver, pancreas, and heart tissue and all that stuff, which most people aren't all that amenable to giving up all their organs
Mm.
for science,
Hmm.
especially at the ripe old age of like 33 or something.
Yeah.
So that's why it's a little difficult to really talk about any particular supplement in translation for autophagy. It's not to
Mm.
say that there aren't beneficial supplements, just to be clear, there
Mm.
are plenty. But translating that in relation to autophagy, that's so hard to measure, is
Mm.
difficult to say. So I'll just speculate and I'll say glycine might be one of those, simply because, again, like I said, the mechanism of action, it does have an impact on this whole like mTOR activation, AMPK activation. So that would be one guess. Potentially Glynac. So in relation to glycine, the addition of N-acetylcysteine to make that Glynac combination because it has such a potent effect on glutathione, which ultimately then does have an impact on again AMPK and all that. So I would say those two, but I'd probably have to look in the literature a little bit more.
Mm. Yeah, some of these like AMPK activators like berberine probably might have also something like that. Metformin, I think, does it as well, rapamycin. And
Oh, rapamycin. Rapamycin for sure is going to be a potent one. Metformin probably as well, because metformin, I think the tricky thing with metformin is that the mechanism of action that it works through, it's got two different mechanisms of action or primary ones. And one of them is directly on mitochondria, which ultimately affects the ATP levels within the cell. And that can have a potent effect on AMPK. And that's one of the mechanisms. So, but the problem with that is that from my understanding, is the concentrations of metformin to actually achieve that mechanism of action are much higher than what we actually consume. So
Mm,
I'm a little like I'm not. I guess I'll just say I'm not sure about that one, even though the mechanism is definitely there for it to stimulate AMPK.
mm, right. Do you think so? There's like some of this data that metformin users might even live longer than non-diabetics not taking metformin. So what do you think about that kind of a studies that does metformin have
Yeah.
any lifespan in humans?
Yeah, that was a fascinating series of experiments or studies that came out. So there was this, I don't remember the exact year. You might remember it better than I do, but there was this one study that came out that looked at the comparison. So of non-diabetics not on metformin versus diabetics on metformin and showed that metformin improved mortality risk over the people that were healthy, quote
Mm,
unquote. The definition of
right.
healthy was non-diabetic.
Yeah.
So that was like that sent ripples across
Yeah.
the longevity space. But the problem is that that data was reanalyzed and redone by another group, and they showed, well, you guys made a critical mistake because the way you defined the experimental parameters was that you looked at metformin as a monotherapy, which it can be used as a monotherapy, but once people progress to later stages of diabetes, they start adding more of these different anti-diabetic drugs, which means that they were then excluded from the analysis.
Mm.
So if people are getting sicker and sicker,
Mhm.
I mean, the what do
Yeah.
you think that happens to mortality, like the mortality statistics? It
Yeah.
massively skews the mortality statistics in favor of the people that are diabetic, but still are only on a metformin, uh, just using metformin. So once that was reanalyzed, they showed that no, it's not the case. If you don't have diabetes and you're not taking metformin, you still are way better off than if you have diabetes and are taking metformin. But just to be clear, that does not mean that metformin wasn't effective. It was very effective. It still improved mortality compared to people who don't take metformin.
Mm.
And in defense of metformin, I don't know if you saw this, but there's a recent paper that I need to cover. I'm just like so backlogged, and maybe you've covered it already, but this study looking at metformin in monkeys and the tremendous effects that metformin has. I think it just released like a month or 2 months, maybe a few months ago, showing that metformin has these tremendous effects across a bunch of different physiological states, and that's in monkeys. So I think that's more encouraging
Mm.
than some of the associative data that we've looked at.
Mm. Yeah, metformin is like very interesting, and yeah, like at the moment I wouldn't start taking metformin as a healthy person, at least based on the data right now. But if you have, yeah, diabetes or even some metabolic syndrome or some like metabolic disorders, then yeah, it can be quite life-saving in that sense. Uh, with regards to like lifespan, then I think the National Institute Aging, the ITP study, they didn't find any life extension from metformin when they did it on their like mouse studies. But there was like another one, Acarbose, which is also like a diabetes drug. That one did extend lifespan. So have you looked at the Acarbose as well?
A little bit. So I just want to caveat this that I haven't done like a deep dive into Acarbose, but the mechanism of action by Acarbose, and please correct me if I'm wrong on this, that it blocks the absorption of carbohydrates or something along those
Yeah,
lines.
yeah, something like that.
Yeah, so something in that realm. So to me, I wonder if what's actually happening is potentially people are just not absorbing as many calorically rich
Yeah.
nutrients, or maybe not getting, glucose spikes or whatever, however you want to describe it. But you're talking about mechanisms that are pre it entering the cells, which I think would have more widespread effects to the physiology. So it doesn't exactly shock me. And the carbos, from what I remember in the ITP, was pretty sound. Like it had a pretty good effect size. So
Mm,
definitely encouraging. Yeah, the ITP studies are a fantastic start to look at some of
mm.
these nutrients for sure. I think what astaxanthin is in there and a few others as well.
Yeah, I think it's glycine,
Yep.
astaxanthin, a few of like some patented herbal supplements, which was kind of surprising. Uh,
Mhm.
but yeah, Acarbose and Rapamycin obviously is one of the most notorious one from there.
Yeah.
What do you think about Rapamycin?
Ooh, that one's I So I'll be really curious on your thoughts on this. So I'm going to throw the question back to you after I answer this because so I've looked at a lot of literature on rapamycin, and it's true that ITP data was really fantastic. I looked at a lot of the human trials looking at rapamycin, and although there was that one recent trial, I think it was called the Pearl trial, that was a little bit disappointing. There were some very good explanations for why it was disappointing. Um, Ultimately, I'm pretty hopeful. I'll just put it this way. I'm very hopeful for rapamycin. I think if it's used correctly, it will end up showing that it has some pretty profound effects on longevity and potentially on health span, especially in people that have chronic elevations of like mTOR activity, so older individuals. I think that rapamycin will probably end up showing a pretty robust effect.
Mm.
But what do you think? Like, where do you land on rapamycin?
Yeah, I do also agree that rapamycin is very like promising and interesting. Like I think it's has the biggest potential of actually moving the needle on human lifespan beyond like what is possible for our genetics. Uh, but yeah, unfortunately, there's no like actual human studies. I definitely would like to see the Matt Caberlain's dog aging project to go into fruition. Like, if those results come out and they're like positive and they show some life extension in the dogs, then I would start giving my dog rapamycin, and I would probably start microdosing myself as well at some point. But right now, we're like I'm at an age where it doesn't make sense yet. If I was something like 60 or 70, 80 years old, then I would take all the metformin and rapamycin just in case, because you have, or you're already at like a pretty old age. But I'm 30 right now, so I still have at least 30, 40 years of time for these new technologies or new findings to come out.
Well, if your pace of aging information continues to be true, I think you've got longer than 30 or 40 years.
Yeah, well, I mean those pace of aging tests, they kind of, I've started to become more skeptical about them over time, because I've seen that they vary quite a lot based on what you
Mhm.
do. Like when I was doing the first test, it was like very good result, but I wasn't doing anything particularly, impressive for my routine. When I did this following tests, I actually dialed down my routine a lot, but I just got COVID before doing the test like 2 months ago, or 2 months before taking the second test. Then it kind of skyrocketed my result a little bit to 0.69. But I didn't do anything else. It was just like this COVID aftermath for the next like 3 4 months that increased that pace of aging test. But yeah, what have you ever looked at like those studies of these tests?
I've looked at a few studies that have used the pace of aging tests. Like there's a recent one with vitamin D and omega-3. I don't know if you run across that one. It just came
Mm,
out maybe a few weeks ago. And that one, I mean, it's interesting. So the pace of aging tests are really interesting. I definitely wouldn't use those as like a sole metric of, oh yeah, I'm definitely not aging quickly, or I'm aging more slowly, or whatever it might be. But they're definitely a tool, and I think they're a powerful tool. They're a super fun tool. They're an interesting tool. But I would want to look at other metrics as well, just to make sure that, but
mm,
once you hit those, like the blood tests, functional tests, like if you're strong within the top, let's say 5% or 10%, your blood values are all within normal ranges, and you've got great, pace of aging tests, like all the indication is pointing to you're doing a really fantastic job.
mm. Yeah. Yeah, I guess the challenge is that if you get a result, you necessarily don't know what to do with it, regardless of what the result is. So let's say you get a bad result. Okay, it means I'm gonna have to, clean up my diet, sleep a bit more, exercise more regularly, maybe take a few supplements and manage stress. But that's the same thing you would do if you get a very good score. So if you get like the best score in the world, are you gonna change your routine somehow, or it's gonna be with the same routine that you would did if you got like a very bad score? So it doesn't really change the practical, the habits that you would actually start doing, which is the exercise, sleep, and diet, and a few supplements.
Yeah, I think I think that's where it comes down to the individual just deciding like what's a good enough score where I'm satisfied. Like I don't want to just keep killing myself trying to get, incrementally shaving off as much as possible. I mean, Brian Johnson, of course, spends $2 million.
Mhm.
Most people aren't going to be able to spend $2 million on trying to shave off every last bit. So if
Mm,
you're doing exactly to your point, the sleep, the exercise, nutrition, a little bit of supplementation, and you're getting, within the top 1-2%. I mean, for me, this is just me personally. I would be like, all right, I'm done.
mm,
I'm sticking to this, and
mhm,
I'm not going to do too much more.
mm. Yeah, this is actually interesting because Brian Johnson stopped taking rapamycin
Hmm.
based on this like recent analysis where rapamycin use was seen to increase the biological age scores, which I think was kind of silly because are you optimizing for the pace of aging, this kind of hypothetical number, or are you optimizing for maximum lifespan? Because there's ton of data that rapamycin extends maximum lifespan or like extends lifespan in animals, but this hypothetical number of pace of aging is such a novel metric that which is the priority? Is like this vanity metric, or is it the actual lifespan that takes decades to actually see if it works? But based on the animal studies, that it would work. Like I would personally would have, I wouldn't have stopped taking rapamycin based on this analysis myself.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that stuff comes down to context too, like the amount of rapamycin you're taking, the type of rapamycin, as in, is it compounded, is it generic? Are you taking it multiple times a week? So some studies use like two times a week. Some studies do every single day at a very microdose level. Are you
Mm,
taking it once a week? Are you taking it every 2 weeks? Like the dosage itself, like there's so many different variables that you can play around with to make sure that you might not get some of the smaller side effects of rapamycin, like cold sores. And I haven't actually, I remember learning about that study. I just haven't taken the time to actually read it yet. But it's those kinds of contexts that allow you to say, okay, well, they're learning that there's this increase in pace of aging with rapamycin. Let me look at the parameters that they used and see how that is represented by some of the other studies that have shown positive effects of rapamycin, and see where
mm,
there might be some difference there that might explain the difference in these results. And
mm.
that's where getting into those nuances is really interesting, but also might offer some answers instead
Yeah.
of like Brian Johnson just cutting it out. I think he also had a few side effects, if I remember, like
Mm,
the cold sores and stuff like that.
right.
But again, I would imagine that his team of doctors would be like, okay, let's start looking at those contexts and let's start playing around with the formulation to see if maybe we can just drop it or extend the time that you before you take your next dose and stuff like that. But
Mm,
yeah, whatever. I
yeah.
I agree with your point.
Yeah. And you know, i- it will be interesting. I haven't read specifically of okay, which studies did I looked at in that rapamycin context, because I would imagine that those studies are done on people who would regularly get rapamycin, which are like organ transplant patients or something like that, which is completely different population than like a generally healthy or like a Brian Johnson type of person. So if their biological age scores increased from rapamycin, then it could be also because of the illness that they had, not necessarily rapamycin. So yeah, like I wouldn't, yeah, kind of jump to conclusions based on that.
I agree
Mm.
completely.
Are there like any other supplements out there for general longevity and health that you're like particularly interested in, or what you've seen studies that are like oh really promising?
Yeah, two of the supplements. One I'm sure you've discussed a lot is creatine. That one
Mm,
is a supplement that I think I don't want to say that has any effect on lifespan, but it has tremendous effects, I think, as a single supplement on health span. So obviously it improves performance, muscular performance. It improves overall metabolism, but it also improves brain health as well, or brain function from the data that I've seen. And my impression is that we're probably going to continue to see where creatine has these different positive effects. There's some effects on the immune system as well, positive effects. There's also some data showing negative effects, just to be clear. But
mm,
when you read the totality of the data and you contextualize it, like, oh, okay. I mean, if a person has maybe a very specific type of cancer, creatine may be contraindicated, but for 99.9% of people, creatine seems to be largely a benefit. There's certainly certain situations where it might not. But yeah, so that supplement is always my number one, or at least up to this point. The second one, oh, actually, speaking of creatine, there's a recent study that just came out maybe a month ago. We'll just say a month ago, looking at creatine and the association with cancer.
Mm.
And they showed a reduction in cancer risk with greater creatine consumption. To be clear, some nuances to that. They were looking at meat consumption. They were not looking at actual creatine supplementation. And there are some small problems that I have with that analysis, but just in general, just throwing it out there, just saying that there is at least that association of an inverse association of if creatine goes up, that there's this decrease in cancer risk. Anyway, so that's one of them. And then the other one that I'm pretty bullish on, depending on dosage, is the omega 3s. Omega 3s for the brain, omega 3s for the heart. Again, those supplements, and it's not like you have to supplement. You can also consume it just from your diet if you want. That's another way to go.
Mm. Yeah, omega 3s and creatine, I think they're one of the most researched in humans researched supplements out there, and yeah, definitely a lot of positive like signs from there. But yeah, but they're not going to probably like extend your maximum lifespan like something more intensive would. Like, and even with rapamycin, it's probably not going to make you live to like 150, 200 years, something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. What do you think are the main factors that hold people back from extending their lifespan, like as a whole, humanity extending their lifespan beyond, let's say, 120 or 110?
Yeah, I mean, I guess there could be like two answers to it. If we want to talk about breaking the kind of hypothetical ceiling of 120 years so that people live to 130, 40, then
Mm.
for that, if you're like theoretically, yeah, like slow down biological aging, as a concept, it, could be real. Some people age faster in many different ways, physically, mentally, aesthetically, whatever it is. So there is, like a theoretical biological age that we all have. And if you, yeah, like slow it down with certain interventions, certain pharmaceuticals or therapies, then, theoretically your body will wear out much slower. So you'll just by you're slowing down time, essentially, and you'll live, decades, a few decades longer. But it's probably not going to, lead to quote unquote immortality, that you're going to live hundreds of years. For that, we probably need to do something more along the lines of genetic, like engineering or gene editing or something like that. Uh, because entropy is kind of always fighting against you, and you can't escape it completely unless you're doing something that we don't know what to do at the moment. So yeah, like that's a very hypothetical, that's very like a sci-fi scenario that we don't even know where to look at it right now. Like there's very interesting like ideas, but for me they've always stayed very like theoretical. There's never been like very practical steps of, okay, this is what we actually need to do to make us live to 130, 40, 50 years.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better myself. I completely agree.
Yeah. Taurine is like another one very popular supplement out there that, people are always asking about from me.
Yeah, taurine's another one that. So taurine has some performance benefits. Taurine has some cardiovascular benefits. The effects are pretty mild, but just because on a clinical scale we don't see like huge effects doesn't mean that in other metrics that we could look at, that taurine wouldn't have some real benefit. And the science paper that released, what, 2 years ago, a year and a half ago at this point, that looked at a bunch of different animal models, but also tried to relate that to humans as much as they could, showed when they looked at some of these non-clinical metrics, I'm talking like stem cells or looking at DNA damage, like stuff that you wouldn't necessarily get on a blood test. They did show that taurine had some pretty tremendous effects. So I think all that grouped together with some of the data, at least that I've looked at in like metabolic syndrome, or looking at some of the performance, and that's why it's added to a bunch of energy drinks and whatnot. I'm not saying that energy drinks are good for you or anything, but although that is something people bring up all the time. Well, thank goodness I'm taking an energy drink. That's not the point. The point being that the reason why they put that molecule in there is because there is pretty good evidence indicating that it does provide a performance benefit. So I like taurine. It's definitely higher up on my list of supplements, but I would like to see more data just overall.
Mm. Yeah, well, caffeine is also like theoretically an AMPK activator, so you're also
Mhm.
getting autophagy from Red Bull, so why not? Yeah.
Hey, well, we'll just forget about the sugar aspect and just.
Yeah, well, you need the sugar-free versions.
Mhm.
Um, we can maybe shift gears a bit to diet. So that's a very controversial topic. Uh,
Yeah.
from dietary perspective, we mentioned like, protein, uh, and certain of these dietary polyphenols that also help with autophagy and generally they are associated with better health outcomes. So what is your like opinions on diet? Like if there was any like general guidelines or, principles of diet to follow?
Yeah. Well, this is tough. This is one of those questions where it's like make or break if a person's going to continue listening to you or
Yeah.
not.
Yeah, it's 50-50.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter what
Yeah.
you say, you piss
Yeah,
everyone.
it does. Yeah, exactly. It does not matter what you say. Somebody's going to be like, well, he was just completely full of it. And then another group of people are going to be like, that was great.
Yeah.
Um, so my perspective is you can look at diet based on like a few basic principles, and then you can start getting into some of the minutia of like the different details and whatnot. The number one thing that I look at is, are you gaining weight on your diet? That to me, that makes the probably the biggest difference on your health. If your weight is going upwards or if it's going down beyond like a certain point where you start getting unhealthy, then your diet is a poor diet. It's leading to serious consequences, metabolic consequences, disease consequences, all kinds of different consequences. So that's number one. Then from there, again, this is a question that people have to ask themselves. What about protein? Like, do I want to prioritize health span and maybe kind of push my lifespan beyond the average? Or do I really want to push lifespan and kind of be miserable? Because those are kind of the two choices that that's where I'm currently kind of circulating around. And I think that because of so many positive effects of protein, like on satiety, making sure that people don't overconsume, which is ultimately what the number one principle would indicate, I'd say that the protein target that you mentioned, kind of like that middle of the road, which is kind of supplementing enough so that a person can build muscle, maintain muscle, but not where they're just constantly consuming protein, especially at the expense of other nutrients. I think that a middle of the road protein level is perfectly fine. So like I would say zero, I think it's anywhere between like 0.72 grams per pound up to 1 gram per pound, which I think is like what 1.6 grams per kilogram or 1.8
Yeah.
grams per kilogram.
Yeah.
So that's one way I would go. And then from there you start getting into some really so okay, we'll talk about dietary fat. So then dietary fat is another aspect that you have to have. You have to have a certain amount of dietary fat. It's not a whole lot, but you need a certain amount. And the literature that I've looked at, the vast majority of it points to unsaturated fats being more beneficial and less detrimental as a whole than saturated fats. Now, I've already lost a few people. So you can get into some more of the nuances of both. So like saturated fats, for example, you have different types of saturated fats. Palmitate is almost universally a negative. It's like every single study that I've looked at, or the vast majority have shown only negative effects to the body. On the other hand, if you look at some of these short chain fats like butyrate, it's a saturated fat, but it shows overwhelmingly positive effects on the
Mm,
body. So then you start breaking it up based on the chain lengths of stearate, myristic acid, palmitic acid. Like there's all these different types of saturated fats. And that's where you start getting into the weeds and whatnot. So, but for a person that just wants like basic information, most unsaturated fats show positive effects. So that's why I just kind of just steer in that direction without having to worry about the intricacies of the saturated fats. But if you do want to get into the intricacies, then there are definitely some nuances in saturated fats that would indicate, yes, some of them can be really beneficial and others can be really detrimental. And then obviously there's layers under that. You just keep going.
mm,
Carbohydrates, that's a personal choice. If you want to consume a lot of carbohydrates, then go for it. Especially depends on your goals. For example, if you're interested in doing some really high intensity physical training, then you may want to be taking in some level of carbohydrates. But on the other hand, if you have trouble losing weight and your goal is to lose body fat, and when you consume carbohydrates, you don't feel satiated, then stick to like a ketogenic diet or a low carb diet.
mm,
There's a lot of flexibility there, and my point being that you just don't have to be tribal. You just have to understand the positives and negatives of each
mm.
diet type.
Yeah, everything has pros and cons, and it's never, universal. Like there's always individual variants as well, especially with food intolerances. Some people can't tolerate certain foods, other people
Yep.
can't, or they can. And even with like proteins and stuff as well, like some people can't eat eggs. Doesn't mean eggs are bad. Most low carb carnivore people would say eggs are great, but even among the carnivore people, there are some people who can't tolerate eggs because of some sensitivities, and vice versa in the plant-based groups. Some people just can't tolerate lectins or nightshades or whatever it is. Doesn't necessarily mean they're bad. It just doesn't suit that individual person. So yeah, depends a lot on
Yeah.
the person.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the level of nuance you can get into this stuff, it's just like when we're creating videos, it's broad strokes. I mean, we're talking broad
Mm.
strokes, and people just take it so personally. But in reality, if you were to have a conversation with either one of us, we'd probably be like, okay, well, what can you tolerate? What can't you tolerate? What do you like? What you don't like? And then you start getting into like this tailored nutrition approach, which I guess people just don't get that sense.
Mm. What is your like nutrition plan, or like overall health routine looks like with exercise and diet?
Yeah, so the one thing I don't talk about is my nutrition plan. So the reason why is because I've seen so many people that I deeply respect say what they eat, and the first thing that people say is, "Well, I'm not going to listen to this person then."
Yeah.
So I just keep that a secret. I've never told
Okay.
anybody.
That's
I
fair
will
enough. Yeah.
say, like, for example, the supplements and exercise and stuff, just because people aren't as tribal about that stuff.
Mm,
Um, because when it comes to my content and the way that I speak, I want to make sure that people are seeing me as just data driven. It's not based on like what I do. I even have a video where I say I am a hypocrite because I don't do everything that the data says is
mm,
optimal. Like I'd say about 80/20. I do about 20% of stuff that's just junk that's not against, that's not for the data. It's completely counterintuitive. Like eating saturated fats, for example. I would totally do that. So from supplement standpoint, I have a few supplements. I take creatine. I'm pretty bullish on it. I take omega-3s at not a very high dose, like around a gram. And then I take lutein and zeaxanthin. I wear glasses, so I like to try to keep up with my eye health. Those are two that have good evidence, randomized clinical trials that indicate that they're beneficial. And other than that, yeah, I think that's it from a supplement standpoint. From an exercise standpoint, I've been lifting weights for over 15 years now. I just do 2, 3 times a week. I don't go super extreme. I try to hit near failure. I hit compound exercises. I make sure I hit my back, my chest, abs, shoulders, and then different. I've got my legs broken up by the posterior chain, so like the hamstrings, and the glutes, and then the front. So just doing quads and doing a little bit of calf exercises. Although don't judge me on my calves because they're they're not of the greatest quality. So
Right.
yeah, that's kind of what I stick to. And nutritionally, I always aim for I do count my calories. Not that everybody has to do that by any means. I've been counting calories for 15, 16, 17 years, something like that. So I've got it down pat at this point, and I just try to aim for weight gain at certain points, just within a certain range, just because I'm trying to build muscle. Uh, but on the other hand, when I'm, then I try to cut down, and eventually then I get to a point where I just kind of stabilize and I stay within, let's say 2, 3, 4, 5 pounds, something like that, plus or minus. And if I'm within that range, I'm happy.
Mm, yeah. Yeah. With a diet, then yeah, it's kind of yeah, people don't even like the problem with that is like, your diet is naturally going to change over time. You're not going to probably eat the same thing 10 years from now. And if you change your mind about it a little bit, I've changed my diet slightly. I'm not eating this food anymore. I'm eating this food now. Then people are gonna like freak out, or they're gonna,
Yeah.
say like, what is this? So it's yeah, then it's very natural for kind of things to change. Like maybe you just change your exercise routine. You need to change your diet as well. So yeah, I guess that's the problem with realizing the context. That the context is always very relevant.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah,
Mm.
and people just get, I mean, it's somewhat understandable. People get pretty tied to the diet, especially if you spend like, let's say 10 years trying to figure out what diet, like you've tried all these different diets, none of them worked. You constantly feel frustrated, and then something hits and you
Mm.
lose body fat, you feel great, and all these different things. Of course, it's natural to then think, well, this is the diet. This is the best diet. Like everybody should be doing this. Why are people talking about these other diets? They don't work. So
Mhm.
I do understand it from a certain perspective. It's just like as scientists, as data-driven people, we have to focus on what the average, when you're controlling for variables and when you're looking at average results. But
Mm.
again, there's a lot of nuance to be had.
Yeah. Uh, Maybe one final thing we can discuss is like sleep. So how important do you think sleep is?
I would probably argue it might be the most important or second most important. I mean, it's right up, it's like I got nutrition and sleep kind of battling it out, and then maybe exercise just a millimeter underneath.
Mhm.
So they're all three of those are like the pillars. Yeah, sleep is unbelievably important. A few tips for that is to make sure to cut caffeine, let's say by a reasonable time. It's going to depend on your type of metabolism, if you metabolize caffeine very quickly or not. But I usually aim for around 12 o'clock. Actually, right now, as we're recording, it's 12. So I would stop my caffeine intake. Another thing is to sleep in a completely dark room. Make sure that it's a few degrees colder than what you typically would be kind of living in. So because your body temperature has to regulate based off that. Um, Try to avoid overstimulation, maybe an hour or 30 minutes before bed, that kind of stuff. And people that study sleep have better tips than I do, but
Mhm.
that's what I've been able to kind of accrue. How do you
Mm.
feel about it?
Yeah, I think it's very important. But I guess the interesting thing about sleep is that you still it only is like best for you if you also do the other things like exercise and stuff. Because let's say you sleep 9 or 10 hours a day, but you don't exercise, then you're probably less healthy than someone who exercises 6 hour who exercises but sleeps 6 hours a day. Because exercises, has all these other benefits in terms of health span and reducing risk of chronic diseases, etc., that you don't get from just sleeping 9 to 10 hours. Just sleeping is amazing and essential for recovery from exercise and getting the benefits. And optimally, you want to sleep 7 to 8 hours as it is recommended. But I think like if you sleep 6 hours and you exercise, you're probably gonna be healthier than someone who sleeps 9 to 10 hours but doesn't exercise. I guess that's maybe a little bit hot take, but both are very important. But sleep is more effective if you also exercise, and vice versa. Exercise is more effective if you also sleep more.
Yeah, I mostly agree. I think there's a cliff where sleep becomes massively more important than anything. Like
Mm,
if you're getting, let's say, repeatedly 5 hours of sleep, I'm just throwing out a number, 5 hours of
right.
sleep, oh, day after day after day. I don't care how much exercise you're doing. I don't care what your nutrition is. You're probably going to die early. You're probably going to
Mm,
have dementia. Like you have a much higher risk of dementia. You have all these different categories that you suddenly fall into this high risk category. I do completely agree that if you're not exercising and you're just focusing on sleep, like you're missing out on a wealth of health benefits that you could be experiencing. Not to mention they interplay with one another. Like for example, exercise improves sleep. Maybe not necessarily right before you go to sleep, but if you in general exercise, that tends to improve your sleep quality and your sleep duration and stuff like that. So there's a huge interplay between those two,
mm.
definitely.
Yeah, yeah, of course. If you're chronically sleep deprived and you're experiencing the symptoms from it, then yeah, that's definitely harmful. But yeah, like if you're only sleeping in and kind of, if you look at the studies, then sleeping 10 hours is actually associated with higher risk. But
Yep.
that's because people who sleep 10 hours usually have like cancer or some other disease. But yeah, like if you're just sleeping 10 hours and you're not doing anything else, then it's not necessarily improving your health. You're getting plenty of sleep and you're not like damaging your health, but you're also not really like taking it to the next level, which you would do with the exercise.
Yeah, completely agree.
Mm. Well, this was really fascinating and a great conversation. Before I ask my last question, where can people learn more about you and your work?
Just look up Physionic, and just type into Google or Chat GPT or wherever, and you'll find me. That's basically the only place. I'm on YouTube. I analyze studies like Siim does, and that's where you can find me.
Great. We'll put the links in the show notes. And my last question is, what's this one piece of advice or habit that you wish you had adopted sooner?
A habit that I'd done sooner. Well, I started exercising pretty early on. I think the one thing that I wish that I'd focused a little bit more on was my nutrition. I spoke about being 80/20, 80% doing the right thing. I think when I was earlier on in my life, I did more, it was more like 50/50. So I think if I just focused a little bit more on avoiding certain, like, let's say, saturated fats and whatnot, just focusing a little bit more on my heart health and whatnot, I'd probably be a little bit better off. Not that I'm in bad shape by any means right now, but that would have been something that pops off
Mm,
the top of my head.
gotcha. Yeah. Unironically, for me, it would be like sleeping a bit more. After my rant that you don't need to sleep that much. But but that was because like in my early 20s, I was kind of starting growing my YouTube and
Yep.
business and stuff like that. So I was kind of shortening my sleep at that point.
Yeah.
But yeah, like I wish I would maybe sleeping like 7 to 8 hours consistently. But I don't think it had like long-term negative effects. But yeah, I'm trying to get at least 7, 8 hours now.
Yeah, that's a good one. That's a really good one.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it was great to talk with you, and yeah, I'll see you around.
Yeah, definitely. It was a blast. Thanks for having me on.
All right, that's it for this episode. Make sure you check out my new book, The Longevity Leap, on Amazon. I'd also appreciate if you share this episode with a friend or family member. Other than that, my name is Siim. Stay tuned for the next episode. Stay empowered.